Doing the top 10 teachings of Brachos, Daf Mem. The first of the top 10 teachings is interrupting between Hamotzi and eating bread to include your friends by saying, as the Gemara says, Tul Baruch, take from the blessing, meaning take bread. In other words, the way Tosfos explains it in Divrei Hamaskal Haba Hava Melech Tzarech Levarich in the top Tosfos of Mem Amud Aleph is the following: to have a Hesech Hadas. There's this idea of an interruption. It's called Hesech Hadas. The word das, which comes from knowledge or mind, and Hesech, which comes from disconnect, meaning the mind is now disconnected from the original bracha, and therefore it is as if there's a separation between the bracha and the thing that the bracha is being made on, and that psychologically disconnects the two, and in many instances will mean that you need to make another bracha again, because it's as if there's a disconnect between the bracha and the act that the bracha is being made for. What's an example of that? The Gemara Malchus, which Tosfos quotes, and the 31st A page of Malchus, it says, Sach ben tefillin l'tefillin tzarech levarich. If somebody speaks between the hand tefillin and the head tefillin, they would need to make a second bracha on the head tefillin. V'chein halacha imsach ben birchas hamotzi la'achila or ben birchas kiddush l'shtia. The halacha is as follows: if somebody did in fact make the hamotzi and then he spoke, not the specific words that the Gemara here in Daf Mem allows, or at least would say does not require a new hamotzi blessing, but if somebody said other things, he decided to talk about who won a sports game or ask who won a sports game, that would be an interruption. The person would have to make another hamotzi. The same thing would be true when it would come to kiddush. The person made the kiddush and then said, well, what's up with the Dodgers or the Yankees or the Mets? That person would have to make kiddush again. Then, so tzarech lachshel levarich ilav milsa d'shaycha l'suda kamo tol baruch. Unless, in this case, when we're talking about making hamotzi on the challah, the interruption was part of what the meal is about. So in the case when the person said, take from the challah, the interruption isn't really an actual interruption. It's part of what the person is doing. He's inviting his guests to partake in the challah that he just made a blessing on. Some of the Rishonim actually explain that for the most part, except for, let's say, Chabad, many have the opinion that when the balabas, especially on Shabbos, makes hamotzi, he's having in mind all the orchim, all the guests, and the guests don't have to make their own individual hamotzi on the piece of challah that they get. So by him saying Tol Baruch, take from the bracha, he's actually ensuring that they get to eat the bread that he made out the bracha for them, having them in mind. So it's considered part of the tzarchei ha'seuda, part of the necessity and what is the meal is about, and therefore it's not considered a hesech hadas. It's not considered a true interruption, and the person would not have to make a bracha again. The same would be true during shchita. Ilav and milsa de shchita, unless that's not just between the actual bracha for the shchita and the first animal that the person shechts, but even if he's shechting multiple animals, we're going to assume we're talking about ophos, chickens that are easy to shecht the number. But if the person starts talking, because that's what happens, the person starts talking after a while, he can only shecht chickens for so long without having a conversation, then he would have to make another bracha, unless what the conversation was about is, no, bring me the next chicken. Then, by the very fact that he was asking for a chicken, or it's part of what the shechita requires, then it wouldn't really be a true hefsek, a true interruption, and wouldn't need a new bracha. Kamaho od yosef behemos b'tarnagolim l'shchach. Are there more animals or chickens to shech? Or he says something in terms of hold on to it in a way that it won't slip. In other words, he's having a conversation that's really about the thing that the mitzvah that he's doing. So in that case, ein zu hafsaka, that wouldn't be an interruption. Now, we go to number 2 of the top 10, which is salt and your challah. Is it about taste or is it about sanctifying yourself? Again, silenced. Let's take a look at the Gemara and at Tosfos. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan amar filo havio melech havio lifta nami in tzarich levarach. Rabbi Yochanan says, even if a person says, after making the Bracha of Hamotzi, before actually eating the challah or the bread, he tells the attendant or anyone else there, please bring the salt or bring the dip, because that was considered part of what you needed to make the bread tasty. And in fact, it's considered part of the, I don't want to say mitzvah, but it becomes like a mitzvah, as we'll see in Tosfos, to dip your bread in salt. Now, the way the Rishonim understand it, and it may actually be in another Gemara if I'm not mistaken, is that it's simply a function of chivuv mitzvah, of you made a bracha on the bread, you want to enjoy the bread that you're eating that you made the bracha on, and therefore by dipping it in a dip or dipping it into salt, and the bread then wasn't particularly tasty, you gave it an enjoyment. However, let's see what Tosfos says. Tosfos says the following, the same Tosfos, if you have a melech in the middle, where we were just up to before. V'anu ein anu regilim lahavi ala shulchan lo melech v'lo liftan. And us, meaning hundreds of years after the Gemara, in the period of the Tosfos, we're not used to having to bring salt to the table, v'lo liftan or dip. Mishum depas shalanu chashuv, because we have good bread. In other words, the whole need for salt is when the bread is not so good. And it's like the story of Rab Sheshes, where he said, this is good bread. He was in the house of the Reish Galusa, the Exarch. It's like being in the White House, so to speak. So of the Jews, he was like he was a leader. He was rich. So the bread, this is good bread. The very person who said you gotta dip the salt or the bread in the salt said, not this type of bread. This type of bread is good. It's prepared. It's ready to go. So since our bread is all ready to go, it's plenty of salt in there. In fact, I talked to my doctor. He warned me, bread is full of sodium. In other words, you'd be better off living in the time of the Talmud. There's probably more people going to die of too much sodium than COVID. I'm not trying to belittle COVID. I'm just trying to tell you, too much salt in your bread. It's better, it's safer if there's no salt in your bread and you dipped it into salt, you'd be much better off. We'd all be much better off. We'd live in a healthier society. But this changed many years ago. Already in the time of Tosfos, they already salted the dough and they didn't need any salt. However, comes another opinion in Tosfos. It says the following. This is a great Tosfos. Mi Rabbi Menachem hayimedaktik ma'od lahavi melech al shulchan. However, one of the Balei Tosfos, known as Rabbeinu Menachem, was very particular to have salt on the table. And we still follow this opinion till today. Not necessarily 100% because of his rationale, but we follow it nevertheless. What's his rationale? K'de'isa b'medrash. Tosfos quotes a medrash, doesn't say where it is, but it's a medrash. We'll trust that Tosfos knew what he was talking about. What does the medrash say? Kishi Yisrael yoshvin al hashulchan mamtinin ze ez ze ad sheyitlu yadayim. The time that a Jew or Jews, I'm talking about plural Jews, are sitting at the table waiting for one another to go to the washing area, wash their hands, dry their hands, make the bracha, dry their hands, come back and sit down till they're all finished that process. That period of silence, it's not such a good Jewish thing. Silence is not a blessing in our tradition, according to this medrash quoted by Tosfos. What does he say? V'hein below mitzvos, and they're doing nothing. No mitzvahs at that time. What mitzvah could you possibly be doing? Okay, sorry for that interruption. So, I gotta fix my phone to stop getting incoming calls while this is going on. My apologies. So, Tosfos says they're without mitzvahs. You're sitting around waiting at the Carlebach Shul before this whole COVID situation, when we had 50, 100 guests on a Friday night. You could be waiting 4 or 5 minutes till 6 minutes, 7 minutes. If you wash first, and then everyone else, 100 people have to wash after you, it's a good stretch of time. You're waiting, you're sitting there. Now, we actually love that time. We sing nigunim, it's beautiful, but I guess a lot of people there, they weren't into nigunim. They didn't know, they weren't chassidim, they didn't know from these things. So they would sit there. Why couldn't they think Torah? They could, but I don't know, they didn't, and they couldn't talk Torah. So it was considered a time where the Sitra Achra, the dark side, somehow, the idea is that the dark side gathers when there's a vacuum. So you're not doing a mitzvah, probably you're thinking in your head, this person insulted me, I'm going to get even with that one, I like this one and I shouldn't like them, right? You're going to be going in your mind with inopportune thoughts that you wouldn't have if you were preoccupied with a mitzvah. I'm just speculating that that's it. There's got to be something really deep here, because to me, I remember when I was in Santa Cruz, one of the people there who was a very spiritual person, let's call him Avraham, it's actually his Hebrew name is Avraham, and he was saying that we would have dinner there, we'd have a communal dinner every week. The small ones on the off Shabbosim were 10 people, and then on the on Shabbosim it was 20, 30, 40, 50, occasionally 100 people. And we do the same thing. We'd sing a nigun between the people waiting around for the Hamotzi. And this guy, Avram, said, that's the highlight of my week. And I already had learned this at that time, many years ago, 20, 25 years ago. And I was thinking to myself, it's such an interesting thing that on the one hand, we have this tradition that that's a dangerous time. On the other hand, I see, but Paul Mamish, people are nispal, people are awakened by the dveikus, by the power of the silence that it draws forth. So it's just very interesting. So maybe the answer is in Tosfos. Let's look deeper in Tosfos. I'm going to tell you what I think the answer is. Tosfos actually gives us the answer. So he says, first, the conclusion is asat mekatreg aleim. It could be that I was totally wrong. Everything I said, that we're doing something wrong because of our lack of mitzvahs. We're doing nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with sitting for 5 minutes in silence. It's not an avera. It's you're not doing a mitzvah. You're waiting for another Jew. So I don't know. Is that such a bad thing? It's a communal thing. It's obviously so. But the fact is, there's another concept. There's a concept that people don't like to talk about, especially contemporary modern people, which is there's a concept of mitzvah, Torah and mitzvahs as a magen, as a shield, as a protector from the mekatreg. The mekatreg is the samach mem, the dark force that's constantly trying to kind of like say bad things about us to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And because we don't have and the Gemara is mechalik and says Torah protects you. A Torah scholar is protected both when they're studying Torah and when they're not studying Torah. But somebody who is a good Jew doesn't particularly know Torah, doesn't study Torah, but they do mitzvahs. So the mitzvah, while they're doing the mitzvah protects them at that moment. But the moment they stop doing the mitzvah, they're not protected by it anymore. So that fits in well with this medrash, meaning the problem with the silence isn't per se that God is anything against silence, or even the Samach Mem is anything against silence. It's rather that there's no mitzvah being done per se at that moment for those who are not Torah scholars, and therefore there's no merit to protect them, so there's a vulnerability. We know from the Gemara and from the Medrash that says there's the moment of wrath, that's what Bilam was able to channel. Maybe that is a representation of the weakness that we have, and at a particular moment that we have a vulnerability. Therefore comes Rabbeinu Menachem and the Tosfos and says, therefore we have a schus of Ubris Melach Magin Alehem. We have the covenant of the salt that we would put on a kol karboncha takiv melach, on all of our offerings. We would bring salt onto. It's part of the covenant. It's the covenant that goes all the way back to creation and the separation of the higher waters and the lower waters, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to protect, and the covenant of these offerings that the salt protects. I want to offer an insight based on the man Shiloach, which is and his student Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, which is the idea of melach has a double meaning. It means salt, and it also means a sailor. And the sailor's job is, now we have sonar detectors of the height of the ship, but the sailor's job was also to kind of guide the ship through waters that to go in with a pole to feel exactly how deep the water is and whether it could go in or not. What the salt represents, according to Ishbitz, is obviously salt in and of itself is not something that we ask people to eat or encourage people to eat. But the right amount of salt put in the right place, which might be why it used to be wiser to just put salt on the table, that then enhances things. And what that represents, according to the Meshloach, is the very powers in our desires and angers that are dangerous. They're not the good part of us. They're like salt. They're the things that if we put them on the table like salt, we sanctify the very things that could make us dangerous, that could make us unholy. Those very things become sanctified, and that particularly what it might be representing. That could be an explanation of why this salt has this power to not just to say, oh, there's a mitzvah because it's the covenant of the salt, that therefore God will look after us and protect us, but it's particularly because salt has a quality in which it's a preservative, and it's also not good in and of itself, but it makes other things good. That represents our Yetzer Hara. That in and of itself, when it becomes too dominant, it's terrible, it's bad news. But when we use it in the right way, then it becomes a preservative, and that might be why we become protected from the very complaints that the prosecuting attorney, not attorney general, attorney angel, is trying to prosecute us with. So that's the end of number 2. Number 3 is feeding your animals before yourself. So the Gemara continues and says, Rav Shesha Samar, Afilu Gavel Aturi, Nami in each opinion is adding on an opinion that the earlier Amore did not agree with. And saying, and even in this instance where a person says need the food for the ox, after they made the bracha of Hamotzi and before they ate the bread, in that case also, according to Rav Sheshes, they would not have to make another bracha. It's not considered a true hesech hadas, a true interruption. Why not? And it quotes Rabbi Yehuda, Damar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, it's forbidden for a person to eat before he puts food before his animal. Like it says in the Parsha of chapter 11 of Devarim that we read in Parshas Ekev, that we say every day. at least 2 times a day in V'hayim Shema, the second paragraph of the Shema. God says, I will put Esav. Esav is the things that grow from the ground, like the hay and stuff like that animals eat. B'sadcha, in your field of Hamtecha, for your animals. And then it says, then it says, the verse continues, and you will eat and be satisfied. What that then means is that just like God first takes care of the animals and then he comes to us, we emulate him and we do that as well. There's a discussion amongst the Rishonim whether or not this is on a Oraisa level or just a D'Rabbanan level, but it is the din. Interestingly enough, it's not the din when it comes to drink, to liquid. It says Dafka, there's the Hishkikis, it says that there's a verse that says he'll give us, first the humans and then the animals to drink. There's a machlokis amongst the authorities of whether it applies to te'ima, to just a snack, or only to an actual eating, like a proper eating. Anyway, the bottom line is, as owners of animals, it's important to understand that we have to take care of our animals. And that's considered part of what we're doing even after we make the Hamotzi. Again, the Rishonim talk about that you shouldn't l'chadchila go and make these interruptions, but if you did, it's not considered a hefsek, and you can eat the bread without making another bracha of Hamotzi. Okay, number 4 is how Torah is different than other things, because usually success is based on a tension of feeling that you're inadequate in some area and you need to compensate for that by succeeding. So for example, if I had a friend or somebody I knew in school that's the most successful of everyone in our class, it's probably because he was always the most competitive. Why was he the most competitive? Because he felt insecure, because he didn't feel that he was good enough to not be competitive. I don't know why. So hey, look at him. He's got the most money of all, because he felt he was missing something. Maybe he had something to prove. And Baruch Hashem, he succeeded. So I often ask people the question, Ezehu Asher, who is wealthy? And everyone answers, Hasamech B'chalko, whoever is happy with their lot. I'm like, no, that's a spiritual, beautiful answer, but that's not the truth. The truth is quite the opposite. The truth is whoever is unhappy with their lot and turns that unhappiness into a burning desire to make the most out of a situation and to acquire great wealth, because they feel that they never have enough and they always need more. In fact, sometimes when I talk to very wealthy people, instead of comparing themselves to people like myself who don't have wealth, at least not physical wealth, they tend to compare themselves to an acquaintance or friend that they have that has double or 5 times or 10 times the money that they have, and say, well, even though I don't have the money that they have, I'm still happy. Because that is really indicative of what drives the wealthy to make more money, is that they don't really, they're saying that, but really they're comparing themselves to somebody who has more than them, that has another home, that has a yacht, a bigger yacht, that has a jet, and so on and so forth, which they don't have. Okay. So we're going to continue. So the Gemara says the following. It's the very wide lines at the bottom of Mem Amud Aleph, the second very wide line. It's a series of teachings from Reb Zer or Reb Chinna Bar Papa. This one says, the attributes of the Holy One, blessed be, is not the same as the human ones. What's the case? When it comes to human utensils, let's say you take a cup. If this cup is empty, which it's almost empty, but there's a drop of coffee in it, so I don't want to pour it on myself. An empty cup, you can fill it up. But if the cup was full, it won't hold anything anymore. But when it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's the opposite is the case. When it comes to Torah, the opposite is the case. What is that? When it's full, meaning a person who's full of Torah, you teach them more Torah, they get a new sefer, they're going to become even more full. You'd say, well, they've had their fill. How can they retain any more? It's a miracle they're able to retain more. But somebody who's empty, meaning somebody who never bothered to listen to their Rosh Hashiva or the Maggid Shir, and now they hear something that you think at least now they'd pay attention because they should know they know nothing, they should want to learn. Comes the Ishbitz and explains what's really going on. And based on what I was already telling you before about usually a burning desire to get something comes at least a psychological feeling of it lacking. The feeling of the lack is what drives you towards implementing that which you lack, and that very deficiency is what becomes the vehicle for your success in acquiring that thing that you feel that you're lacking. So you might think that once somebody has knowledge of Torah, that would take away, because Torah isn't money. When it comes to money, Mishiyeshlo, Me'erot, a Messiah, somebody who has 100 wants 200. But when it comes to Torah, I think perhaps once you know what you know a lot of Torah, there's no burning desire to want to learn more. Comes the Gemara and tells us that no. When it comes to Torah, it's not just that learning more Torah creates more of a desire to know even more. Because that you could even say by money, that even though the rich already have money, they still have a desire to have even more money. So that wouldn't be any different than a Torah scholar wanting to learn more. But it's essentially different. The Torah is what recalibrates the desire of a person. And what it does is it's supposed to be Mishana Esteva Midosa. In Chassidus, it explains, the Lubavitcher Rebbe and also in Ishbitz, that the purpose of Torah is Musar and Ma'asim Tovim, is Ma'asim Tovim and Me'irim. It's about goodness and becoming illuminated in a way that redefines character, that starts working on a very deep level. And when that happens, you'd think, once you become more refined, then the very desire to learn more, the lack, so to speak, the feeling of inadequacy will go away, because that in and of itself is a problem. Feeling inadequate is not so healthy. Kamash Malan comes the Gemara and says, now, when it comes to Torah, even though you are full, even though you don't feel as essentially as an inadequate person, the fullness of Torah doesn't take away from your willingness to get closer to Hashem and closer and closer. The closer doesn't always have to come from richut, from feeling far away, from feeling like a Baal Tshuva. The closer could come lachsos b'noam Hashem l'vaka be'echalov, to taste the sweetness and to want to explore because of the noam Hashem, because of the beauty and goodness of getting close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that the Torah represents. So that's a little bit about number 4. It's such a deep one, we can go on and on there. Number 5 is what fruit was the Eitz Hadas? Not the tree of life, the tree of knowledge. So the Mishnah says the following at the bottom of, towards the bottom of Daf Mem Amud Aleph, that if you accidentally, or maybe on purpose for some reason, made on a fruit that should be a ha'etz, you made a ha'adama, you fulfill your obligation. While pears, ha'aretz, in the reverse, if on a fruit that would normally need a ha'etz, that would normally be a ha'adama on something that's a vegetable, let's say on a celery or a carrot or something, instead of making ha'adama, you made bar pe'etz, lo yasa, you don't fulfill your obligation. Then kulam and all of them, all the fruits and vegetables, if you made a shehakol, you fulfill your obligation. The Gemara says, Mantana diikar ilan arahu, Reb Nachman Yitzchak Reb Yehudi. Okay, first the Gemara says, who is this one who says that the ikar ilan, that the ilan, even if somehow it got disconnected, it got uprooted, it's still nourishing ultimately from the ground, and the hadama would be yotzet. It's Reb Yehuda, and it brings a backup for that claim. And then the Gemara continues. Valperes haaretz. if you make on the Peros arts, Pshita Amar Nachman Bar Yitzchak La Nitzcha Ela Rabbi Yehuda Amar Chita Min Ilon Hi. What's the Chiddush? The Gemara says the Chiddush is that it's only necessary according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the Eitz Hadas was a wheat stalk, or at that time the wheat stalk might have looked more like a tree. So the Mishnah says again that if you made a ha'adama, you made a ha'etz on a vegetable, you don't fulfill your obligation. The Gemara says that's obvious because it's clear that a vegetable is not a fruit. So the answer is, since I might have thought that since Rabbi Yehuda taught in a brisa that the tree that Adam and Chava ate from was a wheat stalk, that therefore you could make a ha'etz on ha'adama, kamash mamun. The Mishnah tells us that you cannot do that. So now let's go a little bit deeper into this whole conversation about what type of fruit was the Eitz Hadas. So the Gemara says the following from the Brisa. Rabbi Ilon Shehakol mimeno Adam Rishon, the tree of what we call the Eitz Hadas that Adam ate from. Rabbi Meir Omer Gefen Haya. Rabbi Meir says it was a vine. In fact, the Gemara says, there's another Gemara that Rashi says that not that it simply was a grape that he ate, but he actually drank wine. Okay, why is that? Because there's nothing that brings woe to a person other than wine, which is intoxicating, and there, like we know by Noah. Noah, according to Gemara, should have learned from Adam, because Adam's fall from grace, what we call the original sin, according to Rabbi Meir, isn't simply that he ate a fruit, it's that he became drunk. That's the understanding. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means. Shenemar vayesh min hayayin vayishkar, like it says about Noah, they got drunk. Okay, that's the first opinion. Rabbi Nechemia Omer te'ena haser. Rabbi Nechemia says it was a fig. It's a fig tree. Shebedavar shemiskal kolubo nisakno. The very thing that he fell from grace, Adam and Chava fell through the Eitz Hadas, that also was the thing they made close. It says Shenemar v'yitpru ala te'ena. It says they sewed together the fig leaves, like the famous pictures. It wasn't an apple, but it was fig leaves. Rabbi Yehuda Omer chita haser. Rabbi Yehuda says it was a wheat stalk, because a child doesn't know how to say father, mother, doesn't understand that this father, it's just a father, mother, until they taste the taste of wheat. Okay, and then the Gemara says that gets back to this, what we said, what the Chiddush of the Mishnah is. I would think that you could make ha'etz at least b'di'evet on something like a wheat kernel kamash malon. Oh, okay. When do we make a ha'etz? Only when you pick the fruit, the branch endures and will again produce new fruit. That's the definition of a halachic fruit tree, which I'm going to get back to. That will be the next one. That'll be number 6, defining a tree for the Bracha of Haitz. But right now we're talking about the tree of life. This is a fascinating Gemara, and I want to share the teachings of the Ishbitzer of the Beis Yaakov of Ishbitz, the son of the Ishbitzer Rabbi and Tzaddik HaKohen Lubin, one of the main students of the Ishbitzer. It's very important to understand that when we learn something like a Gemara, when we learn the Chumash about the story of the Eitz Hadas, that even Chazal understood it in a way that would make it relevant to us. Meaning what? What are the type of things that these 3 opinions represent? One is something that we want to, right now, here on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, there's a huge debate raging and that has to do with certain city agencies that are tasked with housing the homeless and also protecting them from the coronavirus, have turned a number of hotels, with the permission, obviously, of the hotel owners that are getting well paid to do it, into homeless shelters, including shelters for drug addicts, or supposedly former drug addicts, but many of them are current drug users. And in one case, for a number of sex offenders. I believe they already might have worked out removing the sex offenders. We're talking about some pretty serious sex offenders convicted of raping children and things like that. And the West Side already has a pretty solid, for the most part, stable situation where many buildings are used to put up homeless people by through funding, through city agencies, funding, in most cases private companies that administer some type of some more help than others. Some of these particular housing units are super well managed and no one has a problem with. I have one particular one that I'm aware of in my neighborhood, which is, there's zero problems that I know of coming from it. It took me a long time to realize what it actually was, and the point only being is that it's not about homeless. That for the most part, that most of the residents of the Upper West Side might be up in arms is, it's about certain segments of these homeless that might have or do have issues that would lead them more to criminal activity, such as dealing in drugs, buying, selling drugs, violent activities. So people are concerned with their safety and well-being for them and their families. So let's take it back a step. What's really going on is many of these people are essentially people like you and I that became drug addicts or alcoholics, and the drug addiction took away, to some extent, you could argue, their free will. So now they're just, I don't want to call them zombies, they're still human beings, but they're some part of them is like you and I, and another part has this tremendous need to get that high, or to get that alcohol, to get the high from the alcohol. And it's created this horrendous situation that we're seeing played out on the streets of the Upper West Side, that are photographs are being taken. It's a fight raging through. Where is the city heading? It's going to affect the national elections, because all the liberals on the West Side are realizing that the liberal policies also can become a disaster when they're taken too far. Not all the liberals. Some diehard liberals obviously think that we should, open up. Everyone should be evicted from their homes, and their homes should be given over to homeless people. So there's all levels of here. But the point is, and everything in between, I'm not trying to bash liberals here. I'm just trying to say that even a good idea could be taken to an extreme. But now let's understand it through the lens of the Eitz Hadas. These addicts existed in Adam and Eve, according to the Gemara. What the sin of Adam and Eve is, they became drunks, just like Noah became a drunk. And then they couldn't control themselves. And then everything went downhill. So the story that's playing out here is the first story almost of the fall from grace in Gan Eden. That's what's going on. So that's the first opinion. Okay. The second opinion says that it was a fig. A fig represents sexual desire. I don't know why. Don't ask me why. So that somehow they already became, their conception of love became perverted already. Another issue, a second issue. And we can all look around us and see, or look within us and see how deep this problem is in our society. And then the third opinion is it represents bread. Bread today could represent money, which is like people need money, but then again, it could also cross over into something that's not kosher. The other thing is it represents knowledge. The quest for knowledge, which makes us uniquely human, can also it's a mix. It's called the tree of knowledge. It's not called the tree of death. It leads to death. It's Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. It's good. It's the knowledge of good and bad. But somehow, the very concept of once we use the faculty of knowledge to decipher between good and bad, we also start the judging. And then once we start judging, we become judgmental. And once we become judgmental, we ultimately judge ourselves. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. And that's beautiful teachings that you can find in understanding these things. But let's take a step back. This is Ishbitz, how Ishbitz is the deepest. The Ishbitzer learns the Beis Yaakov and even more, Reb Soda, quoting some Zohar, that you want to know where the tree of knowledge is. It wasn't like if you read the simple text, God said, that, by the way, you can eat all the trees except this one. This is the tree of knowledge. This is how they read it. All of the trees are good, and all of the trees could turn into the tree of knowledge. All of the trees are good, and all the trees could turn into the tree of life. It was the same trees. There was no distinction except with what had happened to you as a result of how you ate it or drank from it. It's a mind-blowing thing. There's no tree of knowledge, tree of life as separate trees. They're all, that's such a profound teaching. It's a beautiful teaching. Anyway, that's number 4. That's number 5. Number 6 is defining a tree for the Bracha of Haitz. So I actually read that to you very quickly, because that's where the Gemara says that the branch is when you take the fruit, it's the bottom of Mem Amud Aleph and the top of Mem Amud Beis. Gavza or Gaviza or Gavza v'Hadir Mafik. The branch that produced the fruit lasts and will produce a fruit again. Avahecha the chishaklis leleperi leise leguzah. But when you take the fruit, the branch that produces doesn't last. You don't make a ha'etz, but a ha'adama. So, if you indulge me for a moment, I'm going to read for you from the website of Star K, Rabbi Heinemann. If I can find it. Star K, Bracha of Haitz. Definition of a tree. Because nowadays, if anybody has a question, what they do is they look it up on Google. Let me tell you why you need to be a rabbi. Because if you're not a rabbi, you're going to look up the wrong website. Or you'll look up the right website and you still won't know how to understand it. Okay, let's take a look at what we're finding here. There's a whole conversation of chocolate. No, I don't want chocolate. Star K. Found it before. because I'm misspelling star. Star. Anyway, I can't find it. I found it before. I liked it. My apologies. But I don't remember because it was very technical, but I'll try to tell you what I remember. Basically, it's a perennial, which for something to be a perennial, it needs to be something that the fruit that produces fruits. That's a tree is like it's a woody thing that grows upward. The branches then spread out. The problem with that definition is, as the Star K acknowledges, is that that it doesn't include a vine, and we make haitz on grapes. It doesn't include necessarily a bush like that berries grow on that we also make haitz for. So so there's a limit on that definition. Let's see if I can get this thing to work. Okay. Anyway. The machlokus really comes down to, there's a machlokus rishonim about whether you include something like a tree that doesn't have to be planted every year. I think like a pineapples, maybe bananas, papayas. There's a whole debate about papayas. I make haitz on fruits. I don't make haitz on. I make haitz on berries. I don't make haitz on bananas or pineapples. And mango, it's a big shiloh. It's a big question. Anyway, there is a debate. Shulchan Aruch basically is sides with the side. I think it sides with Rashi. Rashi is the major shita that we follow, which says it has to be a tree that the branches of the tree, which follows kind of the simple language of this Gemara, continue to last from year to year. Okay, so that's number 6. Number 7 is, when I put my notes, here it is. Number 7 is Malchus versus Hashem. Not that they're against each other, but it's a machlokes in Gemara. What's the main part of the bracha? Is it the name of Hashem, or that you say Melech or Melech HaOlam, King of the world, in the bracha? And the way I want to understand it, it has halachic implications, but the way I want to explain it is in the following way. There's 2 elements of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's many elements, even though it's all unified. One element is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is basically removed. Kadosh means separated, above, beyond, transcendent. And the other is Melech HaOlam. Melech means that God is involved, that nothing happens without God's direct hashkafa, supervision. So the question is, when we make a bracha, what is it that we're trying to kind of evoke? Is it the name of Hashem, which is transcendent? And again, there's different ways of explaining this, but this is a simplified way. Or is it the Melech, or Melech HaOlam, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us hashkacha in the world that's involved in everything? And that could be a way of understanding it. Of course, in Kabbalah, the whole concept is that you want to be miyached, the kutshabichu shchinte, you want to be miyached these 2 concepts. But perhaps you could say the antecedent of the Gemara is a debate about which one is the ikar and which one is the tafel. Okay. Bottom line is we do both. So that's number 7. This is something I want to explore more in perhaps a shir as we get closer to Rosh Hashanah, which is connected to the concept of Malchus. Number 8 is Shehakol, which is the bracha for everything, or almost everything. The Shehakol appears a number of times on Mem Amud Aleph and Mem Amud Beis. So, for example, on Mem Amud Aleph, trying to remember where this interesting concept is let's just repeat the Mishnah that I said earlier. The Mishnah says that this is Mem Amid Beis. It's something that doesn't grow from the ground. The Gemara elaborates and says that the Rabbanan is the beginning of the Gemara, right after the Mishnah, in the middle bottom of Mem Amid Beis. Things that don't grow from the ground, like meat of animals or fowl, dug and fish, challah, milk, eggs, vina, cheese, bread that became spoiled. I don't know what that means exactly, because if it's really bad, you wouldn't make any bracha, but I guess it turned into something else. Valayayin, shehikrim, hikrish, I can't read that. On certain foods that lost their original form, you say a shehakol, melech, zamit, kamem, things like truffles and mushrooms, omer shehakol, you say a shehakol. So the Gemara says, we'll talk about exactly a little bit about mushrooms in a moment, but the Gemara says in other places that there's a machlokus. Actually, no, it's on this. It's on Mem Amid Beis on top. It says Valkulim Mamar Shehakol. So it's this theme that's on both the earlier Mishnah and the latter Mishnah. The earlier Mishnah on the bottom of Mem Amid Aleph, and the latter Mishnah on the bottom of Mem Amid Beis both talk about Shehakol. So the Gemara commenting on the first Mishnah towards the top of Mem Amid Beis says, if you said Shehakol on any of the fruits or vegetables, you're Yotzei. And there's a machlokis. Rav Huna says, Chutz min hapasim nayayin. The exception is if you made a Shehakol on bread or wine, you're not Yotzei. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, afilu pas v'yayin also. Even if you made a Shehakol on bread or wine, you're also Yotzei. The Gemara tries to explain what exactly the machlokis is. There's great Torah on explaining that from Rabbi Soloveitchik, and I'm going to really save that because it's really about the uniqueness of wine, about what makes wine so special, that Rashi brings here, and then Rashi brings two other times as well. And that's, I'm going to save that for another shir. And then we go to number 9 about mushrooms. What's the halacha of the mushrooms? And the Gemara asks, why are we calling it a shehakol, that it's not something that grows from the ground? Tanya, anoda b'peiros haaretz, but we learned in a brisa, it might be a mishnah, I have to look it up. If somebody makes a vow not to benefit from the fruits of the ground, asur b'peiros haaretz, mutar b'kamem p'tarios, but they can't have fruits or vegetables, I guess, but they can have mushrooms. Im amar al kol gedulei karka alaya. If they said that all things that are growing from the ground is asur, af b'kamei p'tarios, it would even be forbidden to have truffles and mushrooms. So the answer is, Amar Abaya, he answers that Mibarabu me'ara, manki lo yanki me'ara. They have a relationship with the ground where you could say the following. You could say that they grow from the ground, but they don't draw their nourishment from the ground. Okay, so it's a distinction that basically says when it comes to the neder, we have a stricter, wider net, but when it comes to the bracha, we don't make a hadam on it, we make a shehakol. okay, it's a little bit about mushrooms. I think people are into mushrooms should look at this Gemara more closely. I'm not a big mushroom person, other than, actually, I eat mushrooms. I don't collect them like some people go. There's a whole thing that I have friends that go looking for mushrooms in the forest. And I went to one of my friends' homes once, and I ate those mushrooms, and I ended up in the bathroom for that night. So I'm like,